was when her husband passed away, she spoke. She probably wouldn't be very happy with me right this minute. She got up here, and in that voice of hers, she said, "Let's party." And she would have loved seeing you stand and sing this song. I wanted you to know that. I wanted you to feel that. Because up here, it's amazing. You may be seated. The scene is set. It's the first Sunday of resurrection. The tomb is empty. The disciples, that robust, courageous group of men, had gathered in the upper room and closed the windows and locked the doors and were praying to God in heaven on high that the Jews wouldn't find them. They were shaking in their boots, had they been Texans. They had locked the world out. They had turned and hidden. They had gathered in the one place that they had any sense of safety. And there they were. They just knew that the next knock on the door was going to be more bad news. Their best friend had just died. Not just died, he'd been nailed to a cross and buried in a borrowed tomb. And now the women who went to the tomb came back and said, "He's risen, he's not there." And all they can think of is, who took the body? Where did he go? Who could have done such a terrible thing? Oh, I know the women had come and said, "We've seen him, he's risen." But you know how men are. Careful, some of you are men. Sometimes we're a bit dense, aren't we? And it's not just the men. Sometimes we just go, what a nice thought, but we know about reality. People don't just raise up from the dead. Especially if the tomb is guarded, and especially if they were crucified. And they're there thinking, like all of us might have thought, what could I have done differently? What should we have done? What should Jesus have really done? Maybe we should have stayed out of the city. Maybe we shouldn't have come to celebrate Passover. If Jesus had only listened, we wouldn't be where we are today. That's the setting. They've had all day to sit and ponder and stew and ask the what-ifs of life. And you know those what-ifs, they're never kind. what if we had only done this? What if Jesus? What if the Jews had stayed away? The what ifs of life have no real answers, do they? For they aren't really helpful words. What if? And that's the setting we're in. Don't think that you're very far removed from this room either. How many of you have ever said, what if? How many of you have ever pondered, what could I have done differently? How should have I responded? After all, after all of this, it isn't just the disciples in this room. Yes, we're still celebrating Easter, but isn't there a part of us that are asking some of the same questions that the disciples were asking? Is he really risen from the dead? Oh, we're in church. We know we have to say yes. But do we not ask that question? Our children did. We do. And what if he's risen from the dead? Does it make any difference? Are we going to live any differently because of it? Remember, we're with the disciples in that upper room, and there they are, cowering behind a locked door, afraid for their lives. Oh, we say we're never afraid for our lives when it comes to our church and our God, but sometimes I think we are afraid. I think we're afraid of answering some of the questions like, have we betrayed him? We know we have. Have we fallen short? Any of you fall short this week? I'm not asking for specifics. You can tell your neighbor the specifics. Oh, some of you shouldn't tell your neighbor the specifics, otherwise I'll know. It is a church after all. After all. So as you come into this room with me, with these 10 men, what do you see? There are three things. Three things that I think we see in this room. And the first is the most evident, and that's the fear in the room. These disciples are afraid of the Jewish leaders. Now, that sounds kind of interesting and kind of, why would they be afraid of the Jewish leaders? And I'm going to make it more personal. They were afraid of the church, the Jewish leaders, the high priest, the man who stood before God and the people. They were scared to death of him. They were frightened. It's obvious and it's real that they're afraid. I always love to talk about fear in the terms that Dave Barry talks about. You know, the funny guy. Here's what he said about fear. And while it's funny, I think it's right on the mark. He says, fear is something that we've all had to deal with. All of us are born with a set of instinctive fears, including We're afraid of falling, of failing. We're afraid of the dark. Some of us are afraid of lobsters. Some of us are afraid of falling on lobsters in the dark. Some of us are afraid of speaking to the Rotary Club. Sometimes the most fearsome words are some assembly required. The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear. And fear makes us do things we normally would not do. Isn't that the truth? Fear makes us do crazy things sometimes. It makes us run from the house. It makes us run up the stairs. It makes us cower under the bed. None of those things are things we normally do, but fear drives us to action. I even learned this week that fear determines the price of gold. Did y'all know there's a fear index for gold? The more afraid we get economically, the more gold we buy, which drives up the price of gold. I've been wanting to buy some gold. Would you tone down the fear? It's true. It was established in 1980 or 81. Fear. And the disciples are not strange bedfellows. All throughout those 3 years of Jesus' ministry, the disciples had been afraid of the Jews, of the crowds, of Jesus, of Herod, of Pilate. You name it, they had been afraid of him. And that fear isn't going away. Now, fear, by simple definition, is simply put, false evidence appearing real. Repeat that with me. False evidence appearing real. Now, the problem is, perception is everything. And fear was real to these disciples, and it's real for us, and most of the time it comes because we don't understand what we are seeing or hearing. And the disciples were no different. They were afraid. But that's not the only thing we see in this room. And that's good, because to be stuck in fear is not a good place to be. To be stuck in fear is to be stuck in death. Because what were these disciples doing hiding? They were wasting away. They may as well have not even been alive at that point. Because they were hiding from God and from the Jews. But thank goodness, in this room and into this room comes Jesus. And when Jesus comes into this room, one of the things that comes with him is forgiveness. And forgiveness demonstrated. Forgiveness, my friends, how many of you have ever said, "Oh, I've forgiven them"? Any of you ever say that? I've forgiven them? If you haven't ever said it, you might try it. In fact, say, "I've forgiven them."
I've forgiven them.
Okay, so you know all the words. The problem is the words are never enough. You see, forgiveness is always demonstrated. Sometimes you have to say the words, but you always have to act it out. You always have to love it out. You always have to say, not only, "I forgive you," but then you have to act like you really have. You wish you could just say the words, huh? It's much easier and much nicer for us. But if we're really going to build relationships, if we're really going to be the people God has called us to be, we need to learn to not only say the words, I forgive you, but also to say, I forgive you, and this is how I'm going to show you. And Jesus does. When you read this passage, you see that forgiveness is demonstrated simply by the first words of Jesus' mouth when he walks into the room. Peace be with you. Now, I don't know about you, but these aren't the first words that would come to my mind if I was coming into a room with my best friends and I haven't seen them since they ditched me on Thursday. We forget, don't we? Thursday and Friday was not the disciples' best day. Jesus says, peace be with you, not where the heck were you? Why did you leave me all by myself? Why did you let them hang me? And the only people that showed up was John and my mother. Oh, Jesus could have said a lot of things walking into that room, couldn't he? Where were you? But not Jesus. He looks at him and says, peace be with you. That is forgiveness demonstrated. Because if he hadn't forgiven them, there would have been no peace to offer them. And that's true for us today. We can say the words, we forgive, but unless we bring and offer peace to the situation, we're not demonstrating it. We see forgiveness demonstrated in the assignment that Jesus gives his disciples that day. He says to them, I'm sending you as the Father sent me. If he hadn't forgiven them, he wouldn't have been sending them. Simple. You don't send people to do your job if you don't like them, if you don't trust them, if you haven't forgiven them. We see forgiveness demonstrated through a gift, that gift of the Holy Spirit. It says, go and be empowered. And the Spirit comes and builds them up and encourages them. And forgiveness is demonstrated one other way when he enters that room. He gives them his authority. And sometimes I think we forget that as his people, we too have been given his authority. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you forgive will be forgiven, and whatever you don't forgive will not be forgiven. But not only do we see fear in that room and faith, forgiveness, we also see faith in this room. We see faith restored. The disciples celebrate his being alive. Into that room walked someone they thought had gone forever. Into that room came a fresh understanding of resurrection and new life. Into that room, the living Lord came in and they rejoiced. But it didn't just stop with their faith being restored. Because the next thing we see is that faith is being shared. Remember, Thomas missed the meeting. And so they went and told Thomas, "Oh, Thomas, we saw Jesus." And Thomas responded, just like we would. Yeah, right. See, I know You all thought I was going to say Thomas said, oh boy, yay. But that's not what Thomas said, and it's not what most of us would say. Thomas looks at him and says, show me. Not unless I see his hands, not unless I see his side, not unless he shows me the same thing he's shown you. Then I'll believe. Oh, we make Thomas out to be a bad guy with this. We call him names. That old doubting Thomas. And we forget that it was Thomas who proclaimed so valiantly when Jesus was telling the disciples we have to go to Jerusalem. Thomas says, well, then let's go to Jerusalem even if it means to go to our death. That's so important to this story. For here's a man who spoke with great faith, who spoke with passion about following Jesus, and then whose faith was crushed. Oh, how he wanted to believe. Oh, how he wanted to have hope. But he couldn't. He couldn't do it. Is that not like so many of us? We want to believe, but because of life's circumstances, because of the death, because of the brokenness, because of the divorce, because of life, it seems we can't believe. So Jesus does only that which Jesus could do. And only that which Jesus has been doing again and again and again and again by showing up. For you see, the disciples met again the next Sunday. And this time, Thomas was with them when Jesus comes into the room. Touch my hand, Thomas. Feel my side, Thomas. And Thomas's faith is restored. My Lord and my God, he says. And Jesus looks at him and says, you've believed because you've seen, and I'm so glad. May those who believe and haven't seen rejoice. The story with Thomas at the end brings the whole resurrection story to a complete circle. The resurrected Lord has come back for all of us. He's moved us from fear to forgiveness to faith. And the question becomes, after all this, how shall we live? Amen. Our hymn of invitation today is one of my favorite.